Good afternoon, and welcome to our seminar on the cultural transmission in the Middle Ages. I am Malachi Cohen, Director of the Initiative on Religions and Public Life at the Kenan Institute. And it is a pleasure for me to welcome here both this audience and our world-renowned scholars in the history of science in the Middle Ages. As some of you know, the interaction among Jews, Muslims, and Christians and the impact it has had on the shaping of global civilization, and particularly of European civilization, has been a major concern of the initiative from the very start, and is a research focus and a teaching focus of the international initiative, the International for International Religious Dialogue and Education, the network that the Kenan launched with other universities in Europe and in Israel a few years ago with an ongoing summer school. And just here, in the triangle, we have had for a number of years world-renowned scholars working on the transmission of medical knowledge in the Middle Ages from the Arab world to Europe via the mediation of Jewish translators. And we have two scholars who have been working on it in collaboration with a European scholar over recent years. With us here today, Professor Michael McVaugh, who will be opening with a lecture introducing the project and then speak about his own particular research on the subject. He is Professor Emeritus and William Smith Wells Professor of History at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. His research focuses on the growth of medical and surgical learning in the Middle Ages, particularly as shaped by the 13th and 14th century universities, and on the concomitant medicalization of European life. And he has also been editing the Latin writings of one of the most famous of medieval physicians, Arnold Villanova, and the series is, I understand, now virtually complete. And we shall follow up with my good colleague for many years in the history department at Duke, my senior colleague in Jewish studies, I should say, the smart family professor emeritus in Judaic studies, Joseph Shatzmiller. Joseph is the author of the very famous Shylock Reconsidered, Jews, Money Lending, and Medieval Society, and has more recently edited a volume on Jews, Medicine, and Medieval Society, as well as published a book on medieval Jewish art collections, along, of course, with his very long publication record on European Jewry in the Middle Ages. A person who was supposed to be with us here today, but who could not come because of the flu, is a European. You know, the flu does connect, bridges the Atlantic. Professor Gerrit Boss, who's Professor Emeritus and former chair of the Martin Buber Institute at Cologne University. He's part of the project, and his main fields of research are medieval Jewish Islamic science, and especially medicine, medieval Hebrew, and Judeo-Arabic. And he has a current project, which unfortunately we will not be able to hear about, critical editions of Maimonides' medical works, and I'm sure the audience at the Trinity Institute will be missing his lecture. But we shall plan on having him next year, and meanwhile we shall have our two other prominent scholars presenting us the project on cultural transmission in the Middle Ages. So Professor McVaugh, you will be starting that. Thank you.
Yes, the three of us, Gerrit, Joseph, and I, have always been fascinated by the way a more or less common medical culture was shaped in the Middle Ages by the interaction of three linguistic cultures, Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin, which shared medical texts among themselves by translation. And it is a wonderful example of cultural transmission. In recent years, we've happened upon one particular medical text that made its way from one of these cultures to the others, and we discovered that it provides a unique opportunity to study the translation process in detail and to identify the ways in which the skills, interests, and limitations of individual translators shape the form and content of what they passed on. That particular translation is the focus of, will be the focus of the seminar, but I need to begin, I think, by sketching a hasty historical background. It's going to seem, apologetically, familiar to many of you, even superficial, but I think it's essential to make sure everyone appreciates the dimensions of this event. That background involves the earliest successes in the spread of what is now often called Western medicine, with a kind of casual arrogance. But be warned that I don't mean by that specific modern features like bacteriology and CAT scans. I mean something much more fundamental, something that's a distinctive feature, I think, of this medicine. Its attempt to understand health and disease in terms of general laws, in terms of a broad science of nature. And so to assist that medicine is essentially physical in nature. It doesn't act through magic, through charms, through invocations to the gods, but can be developed by rational inquiry into the natural world. That seems to be the heart of our Western medicine. I hope when I use that term, you'll put quotation marks around it. And like so much else we identify as Western, it goes back to the world of Greek antiquity. Western science starts there too, with Aristotle and Archimedes. And as medical thought evolved there, it accepted the principles of this science and tried to conform to it. From Hippocrates, who's a contemporary of Plato in the 4th century before the Common Era, to Galen in the 2nd century of the present era. By Galen's time, the Greeks had worked out very carefully a material, lawful, scientific system of medicine, all in the span of 500 years that overlapped the gold and silver ages of Rome. But Latin culture was, in a sense, impervious to it, to this medicine. Its interest was in technical matters, primarily law, engineering, while abstract thought, philosophy of science, nature, was of comparatively little interest. It may overstate the case somewhat, but I think it's broadly true. And maybe for cultural transmission, one culture has to see itself as inferior to the other, and the Romans didn't feel that way about the Greeks necessarily, at least not in terms of traditional medicine. They traditionally looked back to hard-headed national traditions of empiricism, charms, and herbs. And so in the late Republic and Empire, we find Greek physicians coming to Rome, hoping for patrons, like the famous Dioscorides in the 1st century, who, a Greek, who in Rome eventually found a medical position in the Roman army, but wrote his famous Materia Medica in Greek. Galen, whom I just mentioned, a Greek born in the 2nd century, came to Rome looking for patrons, promoted himself successfully, treated the emperors, Marcus Aurelius, Commodus, and wrote innumerable works in Greek that nobody bothered to translate for Latin readers. So when the Western Empire collapsed in the Germanic invasions in the 5th century, there was no Latin science or medicine lost, because in a sense it was never there to begin with. But a continuous Greek scientific and medical tradition was maintained in the Greek-speaking Eastern Empire, where Constantinople had been founded in the early 4th century as a capital for the newly Christian emperors, and where wealthy cities like Antioch and Alexandria were home to schools continuing the tradition of Greek philosophy. It's a rich and cultured civilization with wealthy patrons there interested in medicine. That Dioscorides manuscript on the screen was commissioned in 515 by an emperor's daughter. That empire stayed intact until the 7th century, when Islam emerged as a religion and a political force, assimilating most of the territories of the Greek Empire by the middle of the century. Alexandria and Antioch, but not quite Constantinople. At the same time, it expands east into Persia, to India. By the 8th century, it has gone all the way along the North African coast to absorb most of Spain as well. Around 750, it reaches a kind of equilibrium, you might say, doesn't push further. And at the same time, it comes to be governed by a new dynasty of rulers, the caliphs, who established a new permanent capital, I should say, at Baghdad, for a new, wealthy, peacetime society that's growing up, in which, again, as in the Eastern Empire, the Greeks, elite patronage begins broadening culture, patronizing the arts, literature, and science. One of these early patrons is the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who is circa 800 interested in Persian civilization and creates a palace library, a house of wisdom, where Persian texts are translated into Arabic. His son, al-Ma'mun, is much more interested in the Greek world, in Greek science in particular, and enthusiastically encourages its translation. Other members of the elite follow his lead. Because the Caliphate controls so many former Greek centers, manuscripts can be found readily there. They are searched out avidly, brought back to Baghdad for career scholars to translate, especially works on science and medicine. The most famous of these, the best known, I suppose, is Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Syriac Christian, who's famous for having translated almost all of the voluminous writings of Galen into Arabic. But there are many other translators, too, translating all other sciences, like works of mathematics and philosophy. In this way, by 900, most of Greek science and medicine has already been translated into Arabic. But I want to emphasize that this is not just a sterile copying of a Greek tradition. That tradition is being assimilated and developed all across the Islamic world. In the capital, Hunayn himself builds on his Galenic knowledge. He studies the eye and describes its anatomy using pictures in his text, trying to unify his understanding of the eye through Galen with the new optical theory that translations of Euclid are bringing to his attention. The Persian side of the empire can be represented in medicine by clinical writers like Razis and synthesists like Avicenna in the 10th and 11th centuries. The Western Spanish side can be illustrated in the 12th century by Al-Ghafiqi, who emulates, certainly, but arguably surpasses Dioscorides, or illustrated by Albucasis, composed a remarkable medical encyclopedia of which the surgical section is absolutely revolutionary in the 12th century. No one had ever really produced a separate treatment of surgery like this, including Galen. And as you see, the instruments themselves are described for readers. Then the unity of this medical world can be exemplified in Maimonides, who, in the same period, the 12th century, moves from Cordoba to practice in Cairo with great success. So this is one medical community united by a system that is basically Galenic, but, to repeat once more, a developed and articulated Galenism. From Persia in the east to Spain in the west, there are new drugs emerging which can be fitted into that model, while Avicenna's canon provides a structure for the system that Galen never offered. His works are all individual treatments. Avicenna brings it all together. It's a huge, but arguably a tight, compact work, despite its size, a sophisticated blueprint for the whole system. So in the 12th century, that whole world from Spain to Persia is captured by the principles and program of Greek medicine, but it surpassed its Greek origin and has carried Western medicine further. All these events left medicine in early medieval Europe unaffected. It had inherited only a scanty Latin medical tradition. Then the intellectual elite of the early Middle Ages, the Christian Church, had other concerns. So early medieval European medicine is mostly a matter of charms, prayers, and recipes. Basically, it's a local craft activity down to the year 1000. But in the 11th century, Europe started to recover politically and economically and become an expansive, outward-looking society again, becoming aware of the Islamic world to the south and west. There was a slow trickle of pilgrimages from Europe to Jerusalem and back again, and in Spain and Sicily, attempts to retake lands that had been lost to Islam. They all began well before the Crusades formally start in 1095. These contacts gave Europe a perception of its inferiority, of the richness of knowledge on the other side, and that begins to seep in. The first seepage is perhaps the Arabic numerals, which are first seen in a manuscript of 978 from a monastery on the Spanish frontier. The end of the next century, the end of the 11th century, sees the first important Latin translations of writings from Arabic. And they're actually medical texts produced by the man known as Constantine the African in southern Italy at the interface, really, between these two cultures. And then in the 12th century, there is a flood of translations. In 12th century Spain, Toledo had been recaptured in 1085. A Christian kingdom set up there, the capital moved there. And in a couple of decades, Latin scholars start making their way purposefully to Toledo to translate the knowledge of Islam. One man epitomizes the process, the famous Gerard of Cremona in northern Italy, who arrived in Toledo about 1150, and in 30 years before his death in the 1180s, translated something like 70 medical, scientific, and philosophical works from Arabic. Often huge works, Avicenna's Canon being an example, works of Avicenna, Rhazes, and Galen. The process of translation continues on through the next century, but with Gerard and Constantine being the most important, the Greek and Arabic medical and scientific tradition is mostly available in Latin by 1200, though, as we're going to see, translations from Arabic continue to be made throughout the 13th century. Available, but availability and assimilation are two different things. We'll come back to this later, but think for a moment about the particular problems involved in communicating a new body of thought, like medicine. The very first problem is terminology, and here it's intense. Arabic is, for Latins, a new and structurally very different language. Translators, usually faced with the unfamiliar, try for word-to-word transmission, which seems safest. If they come to a word which they can't recognize, they'll transliterate it if necessary. But the very words in a new subject, like medicine, and remember it is new for 12th century Europe, nouns and verbs, concepts, are often meaningless in isolation before the wider system is understood. Remember, the Latins had little exposure to this earlier medical tradition. The translators were forced in the 12th century to create a new Latin technical knowledge as they went along for things they knew nothing about yet. Take anatomy, for example. The Arabic texts tell them about the membranes in the brain. Does the brain have membranes? It's not something that the 12th century necessarily knew, but all right, it has membranes. How do we refer to them? They take over, inevitably, the names that have been given to them in the text that they have, so that one of the membranes in Arabic called the gentle mother, the al-Rakika, that becomes translated as the pia mater. And as a pia mater, it's still as part of our anatomical terminology. So gradually these new conceptual frameworks expand enough to make sense out of the individual terms, and like anatomy. And in the case of anatomy, that led on fairly soon to the beginnings of European surgery, based on the Gerardo Corona's translation of Albocasta's surgery. The Latin translation maintains, you see, the instrumentation of the Arabic text. We get the first original European anatomical writings and surgical writings at the end of the 12th century. A knowledge of anatomy is inevitably integrated, has to be integrated with the new concepts of physiology, that the body acts through its qualities or complexions, embedded in the humors or bodily fluids. Once that's understood, it allows them to understand pathology, how an excess or corruption of these humors leads to illness, and that in turn leads on to issues of therapeutics and pharmacy, how the drugs that are mentioned in Galen and in the Arabic pharmacologies counteract or expel the dangerous parts of the humors. And then beyond all these novelties, the translations are passing on this new set of values, the core idea that medicine is an intellectually coherent discipline. It's not just prayer, charms, and trial and error empiricism. And that's absolutely strange to Europe. And there's a crux, which I'm going to say more about. Why did medieval Latin society find it easy to be convinced that this new, learned, theoretical, scientific medicine was good? It doesn't obviously have to be true. The Romans weren't particularly convinced that it was true. It's not inevitable. Cultures are different in how they do or don't respond to new ideas. The idea of medicine as a rational science to be studied in books was accepted because just then a unique system of education was evolving in the Middle Ages, specific, I think, to European culture. And medicine very soon got grafted onto it. Let me go back to the Islamic world for just a moment. There, medicine was typically a family tradition. You learned it from your father, although you might also learn it in a loose form of apprenticeship, or even looser, you might listen to a series of public lectures in the market. Primarily, it's a matter of assimilating to memory. These are not truths to be debated. And when you had felt that you'd mastered what the teacher had to tell you, you moved on to another teacher. There is no final exam that certifies you as a physician. Indeed, there's no license to practice in classical Islam. The most there is an official in some cities, the muhtasib, who checks on the markets, regulation of markets, and by extension can lay down standards for drugs and for medicines. Basically, you were a physician if you said you were a physician, and if you could find people who would seek your cures. There's no diploma to show. At most, you had an ijaza, a piece of paper with the signatures of people whose lectures you heard. It's a sign of your training, but it doesn't certify anything about what you had learned, or certainly doesn't say what they thought of you. The 12th century Latin readers of these medical texts that we talked about in translation would have found hints of that system in those translations, and would have found it very familiar. That's how the medical craft had always passed on in Europe too, through a loose apprenticeship with no formal certification. Medicine was still not a subject for formal education any more than in Islam. But education more broadly was changing in the dynamic 12th century Europe I described. Education trained then for the church, primarily, and every city had its school at the cathedral. There, a handful of teachers was allowed to teach by the authority of the bishop, and they're beginning to put together a kind of curriculum that informally spreads across Europe. First, in the liberal arts, where you study a little basic logic and grammar. Then in theology, where by the middle of the century, a standard text has appears that assembles all the interesting questions in theology for debate. In canon law, church law, where at the same time a systematic collection of papal and conciliar decisions has been put together. That's the decretum of Gratian. You need the new kingdoms of the 12th century need civil lawyers as those kingdoms become more sophisticated, and the students of civil law begin to focus on the corpus juris civilis of the Romans. In all these fields, there is an agreed basic text or agreed basic texts, and everywhere the teaching technique is becoming standardized and quite distinctive. You analyze the statements in your texts, you criticize them, you add your own innovations. For example, you'll see in that Gratian manuscript that the core text is of those two little blocks in the center under the illustration, but around that there's a commentaries by other teachers who have reflected on what the text has to say, and the students have assiduously put their own comments and criticism in the margins between the commentaries. It means that this system of education that's emerging means that the views of earlier teachers have to be dealt with by the later teachers. There's still no standard for what you have to know. You study this curriculum until you've learned what you want and you leave, but there's an unwritten collective informed tradition, an informal community of knowledge, I think, that's growing up. Medicine, as it's established as these subjects, is not traditionally a subject for rational learning, but it's starting along the same path. Around 1100, a community of physicians in southern Italy, at Salerno near Naples, begins to teach medicine from books, settling eventually on 6 or 7 simple, uncomplicated, practical texts that they think any student should be familiar with. Hippocrates' aphorisms, practical texts on how to interpret urines or pulses. Still, of course, we're in the 12th century still. There are no requirements, no examinations, and no degrees. Students drift in when they like, leave when they like, to go teach or practice themselves. Then in the period 1200 to 1225, is a totally new kind of institution invented, the university, entirely original to Europe. It grew out of these teachers' conviction that they were the only ones who deserved to judge who was truly competent to teach, and the only ones competent to decide what should be taught, not a bishop. It started with liberal arts teachers demanding autonomy, and it ended by 1230 or so with society conceding to teachers the independence of their guild. Universitas originally meant a guild. It's they who can now decide what to teach, what knowledge allow the student to join their ranks. They can hold examinations. They qualify you. They give you the degree of bachelor, which gives you a step towards the degree of master, which allows you to join that guild and to teach in your turn. This could only have happened given a growing public acceptance that learning and freedom of learning is valuable to society. Independence has been conceded to teachers of liberal arts in Paris by 1231, but teachers of medicine got that independence even earlier, at Montpellier in southern France in 1220. That Montpellier school is now different from the one at Salerno, because now you can't just decide you know enough to teach. It's your masters who have the collective right to decide when you were well educated enough to join the Guild of Teachers. Of course, what they were still studying at the beginning is the same curriculum that goes back 100 years, the short practical translations of Hippocrates, which they study with the same techniques of analysis, questions, and debate, back and forth, rational argument. But the teachers at Montpellier couldn't help but be aware of the new exciting works of Greco-Arabic medicine that were now available in Latin. And they started using the Arabic translations to help enrich their students' understanding of the basic curriculum. First, they turned to Avicenna's great canon, because it gave students a good preliminary sense of the structure of Galen's thought. Avicenna is an important philosopher too, that's revealed in the canon, so the canon gave Latin readers a sense that medicine was a science of cause and effect and a kind of subset of Aristotle's wider science of nature. Then these teachers went on to explore Galen's own writings, which Gerard of Cremona had translated, and fused Galen and Avicenna together. In all of this, I think you can perceive a rapid and easy transition. There's no sense in the school that's just devouring this new material. No sense of strangeness. Galen and Hippocrates, Avicenna and Rhazes and Maimonides are being absorbed not as pagans, foreign and alien, but as teachers to be admired and revered. Meanwhile, more translations are appearing. Many Spanish Jews had begun to migrate to southern France in the 13th century. They hadn't yet lost their Arabic, and they collaborate in translations of still other texts. Simultaneously, they begin to translate Arabic medical texts into Hebrew, struggling at this point to make a largely biblical language into one that could express a technical science. By 1300, the old university curriculum had been outdated, and the translations from the Arabic were becoming the core of a new curriculum that every student had to read, while Montpellier had been joined by Paris, Padua, and Bologna as schools training a new generation of what is now, doesn't happen before, now a medical profession. This kind of professional training was immediately successful because it fitted in with a change in wider European values. The university had been a kind of experiment when it was first founded, but now it had proved itself. European society had accepted that professional qualification led to higher standards. Kings and towns wanted the products of law schools who had guaranteed legal expertise. The church needed university graduates who could be expected to be competent administrators. The 13th century is the first age where the public so obviously has a widespread belief in reason and its practical application. The European public easily accepted this was true of medicine too, and demanded the new kind of physician with academic certification. From the late 13th century on, towns are requiring that physicians have to have some academic training if they're going to be allowed to practice. Still very different from the situation in the Islamic world. There, a town may have a more passive checking up on individual barbers, but in Europe, town governments are increasingly insisting that practitioners have to demonstrate their qualifications before they can ever practice. I've traced all this background at such length for two reasons. First, I wanted to make sure you appreciated this astonishing episode of cultural transmission when the Greco-Arabic medical system is assimilated by Western Europe. The second, and more importantly, I want to point out, I don't suppose it's been lost on, the point's been lost on you, that when a cultural system is transmitted, it inevitably has a different shape in the two cultures. The transmission of medicine obviously wasn't a communication of brute facts, but of ideas and theories that had been formed in one culture and had to be assimilated into a very different culture, one communication, or if you like, one translation at a time. I've wanted to show that the peculiar circumstances of medieval Europe, this appearance of church schools and their model of analysis and collective discussion of texts, meant that the Greco-Arabic medical system was approached in a new way. As a body of knowledge that wasn't just committed to memory, but was expected to be discussed and tested and probed while being studied, which meant that medical students were trained and eventually examined by their teachers, not just in fact, but in a kind of critical thinking. And it's a body of knowledge that now is being added to, modified, and finally ratified or certified only by a collective community, this professional community for the first time in history. You can think of that cultural transmission as the summation, the integration, if you like, of hundreds of individual medical and scientific translations produced over 300 years. Translations just like ours that we're going to be talking about. Each one a different kind of negotiation between two worlds. And to completely understand the integration of the whole, a kind of historical calculus, you'd have to understand what happened in an individual act of translation. And yet, that seems to be next to impossible, given the peculiar problems of medieval translation itself, which I mentioned before, but now want to come back to consider more closely. And I'm going to risk illustrating them by contrasting medieval translation with a modern one. And I hope you're not going to think it's too far-fetched. Most Anglo-American readers know Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu in the translation by C.K. Scott Moncrief, which he entitled Remembrance of Things Past. It won enormous admiration from the moment it was published in the 1920s as a literary creation, admiration as a literary creation, and yet on the other hand has often been attacked by purists who say, but it isn't Proust. And it's true. This is an often inexact, maybe even deliberately inexact translation. The title is actually a direct quotation from Shakespeare's Sonnet 30, and yet it was brilliantly successful in transmitting Proust's vision and making it possible for English culture to totally assimilate it in the 1920s. The French Proust and the Anglo-American Proust are different, sure, but different in ways that we can now appreciate were shaped by inexact parallels by Proust's life and Scott Moncrief's. There's been a recent biography of Scott Moncrief, which is why this is on my mind. And it explains why English readers of the 1920s could feel so convinced that they understood that French world of circa 1900 so well, even if they weren't reading Proust. We can appreciate this cultural transmission because we now know the lives of the two men and their different worlds so closely. And if we want, we can begin to appreciate why Scott Moncrief might have chosen, maybe unconsciously, to replace one French phrase by an English one, different yet meaningful to a contemporary English audience, like the Shakespearean phrase that's in his title. Well, medieval translation was nowhere as simple as Scott Moncrief. First, there was almost never a single translator involved. Scott Moncrief knew French, but Gerard de Cremona didn't know Arabic at all when he got to Toledo. He and virtually all medieval Arabic Latin translators had to work with a second person, a now usually invisible and anonymous collaborator who did know Arabic, who would translate a text out loud into a vernacular that the two of them shared, so that the translator could then put it into Latin and write it down. If they came to an Arabic word that the collaborator didn't know, they would skip that sentence, or maybe give a translation for the mysterious word and go on. Whereas Scott Moncrief, of course, could turn to his Dictionnaire Laus. Second, we know exactly what words both Proust and Scott Moncrief wrote down. Exactly. Their words were published in thousands of copies of a standard edition, every one reproducing exactly the same text. But we don't know what words Gerard of Cremona actually wrote down when he translated Galen. The manuscript copy that he would have prepared in the 1170s was copied and recopied again by centuries of scribes who made mistakes in copying or who tried to improve the style of the original. And the wording of the copies, which are all we have today, may be far removed from the original. How can we tell? Of course, exactly the same thing is true of his Arabic copy text. How can we tell what it looked like? Most medieval translations, if you want to study them, medieval translations, it seems to me, are rather like a black box. You have a hypothetical copy text, you have an anonymous collaborator who's putting something into the space between the two. There's the black box. And then on the other side, you have hypothetical Latin text that you have to reconstruct from surviving copies. And if you're lucky, the name of a man like Gerard of Cremona. The content of the black box, the details of what happens when information passes at that moment from one culture to another, one culture, one world, one person to another, seems fated always to be invisible to medieval historians. And that's why we feel so excited to get to why this matters. the text we've come across breaks open, I think, for the first time that black box of a particular medieval translation and lets us see in amazingly close detail what went on inside. We know not just who both the members of the translation team were, but how they used their individual skills and thoughtfully negotiated, word by word, the transition from Arabic to Latin. Our text is a regimen of health attributed to a famous Spanish Muslim physician of the 12th century, Ibn Zur, a member of the Ibn Zur family. It's not clear which one he was. And it was translated from Arabic into Latin at Montpellier in 1299 by a two-man team. A brilliant Jewish astronomer-physician named Jakob ben Mahir. Many people would say that he's the greatest astronomer of the 13th century, who could read Arabic, and a Christian surgeon named Bernard Onofredi. And the work is commissioned by a master in the medical faculty at Montpellier named Peter of Capestaing. We were fortunate in having one manuscript out of all those that have survived. One reports this evidence and gives us the name of the participants in the work, where it was done, when it was done, and why it was commissioned. And the commissioning is of great interest. We're in a world, 1299, in a university setting where it's now academics, teachers, masters who are, it's not elite patrons, it's not kings who are commanding this treatise. It's a master at the faculty who wants the new knowledge to be imported into his own discourse as he teaches. Ben Mahir was a philosopher in the Maimonidean tradition who actually then went on to produce his own Hebrew translation of the same text. Onofredi is unknown, but his mastery of the Latin shows how even a practical surgeon believed that learning was crucial to his subject. The details of how these two went about it, the kinds of evidence we've used to work out the details, is what we're going to be talking about here, because it provides us with a real intellectual puzzle that's satisfying to think about. I'm going to begin by talking about the Latin manuscript evidence and what it shows about how these men from two different cultures went about working together. I'm going to talk briefly about the Hebrew translation that we prepared and the problems that Hebrew translators from the Arabic faced, summarizing some of what Gerrit Bos would have said had he been here. And then Joseph will present the life and personality and achievement of the principal figure in all this, Jakob ben Mahir, to help us understand his motives for translation and for collaborating with a Christian in a Latin translation. After that, we'd be delighted to talk more with you about the details of what we've been doing. So to turn now directly to this text of ours, to try to understand how this team, what this team produced and how they did it, this Latin translation, the first thing that you have to do is to try to establish what that text looked like. We're trying to find the printed edition of Proust's of Moncrief's English translation. What was actually set down? I've already told you how difficult it is to decide that. But what you have to do is to reconstruct it from the surviving copies. Our search of manuscripts looking for this work led eventually to 14 copies distributed through European libraries. The earliest from 1319, just 20 years after the translation was made. The latest from the late 15th century. 14 manuscripts is not a great number, but it's a reasonable number for something produced in medical work produced locally about 1300. I think suggests that it was found to be of some interest. You identify your manuscripts, and then you have to look at them closely. The manuscripts from Cambridge, from the Vatican, are online. You can just, with a click of the switch, with a click of the mouse, you can find them. Two others we found in published microfilm collections, the Sloan manuscripts. But most of them had to be ordered. And I promise you, you wait, anxiously waiting for them to get there. In the old days, when you asked for a microphone, now digital versions come much faster. And once you have them, then you have to look at these 14 manuscripts and decide if they're all usable, because this is a work of 34 chapters that have come down to us, and not all of these manuscripts turned out to be complete. In the end, we found that only 7 of them seemed to be worth close study. One of them, fortunately, that one, which I showed you of that one, which had the short history attached, the one that is closest in date to the origin of to the original translation. But closest in date doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be the best manuscript. So, settling on 7 manuscripts, then the next thing to do is to recognize how they differ. And for that, you have to read through the manuscripts, word by word, and make sure you know where they agree and where they disagree. You won't believe me when I say that it's fun to do, but it really is fun to collate manuscripts. And you will see from this very short chapter, beginning of chapter 19 of the 34 chapters, that if you look at those collections of variations down there at the bottom, you'll see that there seem to be 2 big groups of manuscripts which tend to, they agree with each other, but the group of 3, the group of 4 are consistently distinguishable. CQS and ABTU, you'll see. And it suggests that these texts reveal something of the history of these texts as you go back in time. You can make certain inferences about them. You may even guess that these 2 families of manuscripts began to diverge at an early stage. But how do you decide which of them is correct? For example, here you can see in note 16 there that one family says removent and the other says mitigant. Well, what did the original Arabic say? Here students of the history of translation have an advantage, because if you find the Arabic text gives you a way to control the variant readings that you have. If the Arabic text has a word for remove and not for mitigate, you can guess that probably CQS has a better reading. And if you can do this over and over again, you may be able to decide, well, perhaps that's the safer tradition to follow. The catch was, for us, in our case, that no Arabic manuscript of this text is known to survive. Ibn Zur is a famous, the Banu Zur, they're a famous family. We know a great deal about their writings. There are catalogs of the manuscripts of their works, and nobody has ever found a copy of an Arabic text that might be the original of this. So, how do we work back to that text? Well, remember that we also found copies of a Hebrew translation that had been made by one of the partners in the Latin team, Jakob ben Mahir. 2 manuscripts of it. We treated it in the same way. We looked at the manuscripts and compared them, collated them. Fortunately, only 2. One of them, now in Jerusalem, we could tell pretty clearly was made word for word from the original. When Ben Mahir had come to Arabic words he couldn't understand, he had transliterated them, typically, in Hebrew characters. The other, in Bologna, at some point in the history of this copy, a scribe had decided all that Arabic is unnecessary to transliterate, and had just left it out. But we're still left with a common text, of course, where the Hebrew, where Ben Mahir understood how to translate into Hebrew, that they share this text, and here we have to decide which is the better reading. And here, paradoxically, the Latin can help us decide. What we found once we had established, once we had these two texts and compared them, we produced, again, a kind of hypothetical Hebrew text that could be compared with our Latin text, and to let us decide which readings were best and what the original translation might have looked like. And what we found very broadly was over and over again that the readings in CQS were often literal equivalents of the Hebrew. You understand, the Latin isn't translating the Hebrew. The Hebrew comes from the Arabic, which is lost. The Latin comes from the Arabic, lost. But if the Latin reading says mensa, and the Hebrew reading says shulchan, you can guess that you can be pretty sure that the Arabic word said table, and that they're both in their different languages casting it this way. We also found that this tradition, CQS, omitted many of those passages in the Hebrew translation where there have been Arabic words left in transliteration. The other family, ATBU, was less literal. So there's often where the Hebrew said mensa, you sit down at the table at mensa, let's say, or go to the table, shulchan in Hebrew. The other Latin version would say something like, when you want to comedere or edere, they would not use that. It would be more beautiful, if you want to say, more stylish, less literal, less crude. And often this family offered translations of at least a part of those Arabic passages that were missing in the other family. And we've concluded, and for reasons that I don't have time to go into, but we can talk about them if you like. We concluded that these differences were products of what had gone on inside the black box of the translation. That we think that Ben Mahir and Honofredi worked in two stages. First, they made a quick literal draft. Ben Mahir starts going word for word through the Arabic, speaking in Occitan, and Honofredi translates the Occitan word into Latin. If they can't immediately find an Occitan equivalent, they will discuss it back and forth, saying, here's what it means. I don't know how you'd express that in Occitan, and they evolve a sense of meaning that Honofredi can then put into Latin. The phrases or sentences with Arabic words that they couldn't understand, they left out. But they meant to come back to them after they finished the first draft. When they were through, they went back and began to revise their draft. That draft is sort of represented by CQS. Then they went back and began to revise it. They managed to solve some of the omitted Arabic words. They corrected, you can tell, they corrected errors that were made in oral transmission, because you're speaking, you're sitting in a room, the buzz of noise outside, and you can't always, Honofredi couldn't always be sure that he didn't know that he'd misheard Ben Mahir's word, and he wrote down something else. They corrected this in the next version. There are a number of places where you can see this happening. And the vocabulary is made more meaningful and more familiar to the potential readership, the readership of the academic community. This is a developed academic community now, and there's a kind of standardized language that's emerged in the history of the university, and a translation needs to be adapted to that community if it's going to be written. I think this is bound to have been Honofredi's particular role, and the result is mirrored more or less in our ABTU. Assuming that this was the translator's plan, it worked. That version was adapted, that ABTU version was adapted very successfully to the professional culture of 14th century medicine, much better than the draft would have been. And we know, we've been able to find that the teacher who commissioned the work took it with him when he moved from Montpellier to Paris to teach in 1315. And about 1330, that quotations from that work begin to pop up in texts written by his fellow colleagues at Paris. So it's made its way, the translation of 1299 has made its way into the network of medical texts in the academic world within 30 years from the time it was translated. It's impossible not to wonder whether other translations, as far as I know, this is the only cases like this where you can tell that a translation has been made in a draft and a revision are rare, if known at all. And it's impossible not to wonder whether there were a lot of others that we simply don't know about. But I rather suspect that translations like this in two stages were a late phenomenon, because in the days of Constantine the African or Gerard Cremona in the 12th century, there was no, these were not translations made for an academic community. They're not made to fit into a generally accepted medical discourse. They can be done word for word. They don't have to be polished. Who are you polishing them for? They are generally word for word translations. And if you look at Gerard Cremona's translations from Arabic into Latin, he always uses the same word in Latin, always corresponds to the same word in Arabic. But once the universities had come in the 13th century, shades of meaning were important in translation. You had to make sure that your translation dovetailed with what people already knew, and I suspect then you might find other translations. At this point, you may find other translations like the one we're studying. One more thing. Remember, there's a second translation that we could be thinking about here, and that's the Arabic-Hebrew translation that Jakob ben Mahir made for himself. Not in collaboration, just on his own. And in this case, he proceeded the way he did in the first stage of that collaborative version. Some people talk about four-hands translation, you know, where you've got two people sharing it. He's just doing it on his own. And he did it word for word, copied it out for himself, or perhaps dictated it to a scribe. We don't know. As I say, we've got two manuscripts of the product and have constructed his text from them. And the reconstructed text suggests that he didn't really care. He did it in a hurry. He didn't really care about grammar, so that cases are all over the place. The tenses vary. Sometimes he'll say, you should do thus and so, and sometimes he should do thus and so. It's not grammatically consistent, but it's like a rough draft. I've already said that he couldn't always understand the Arabic, but he wanted this to be a complete version, and so every time he came to an Arabic phrase, he included it in some form or another for future use. Hebrew at this point is just beginning to develop, and here I'm speaking for Herod, and I speak as a fool, as the Bible says. But I'm repeating what I think he might have said in much simpler detail. Really, Hebrew, the medical Hebrew is just really developing as a language in the 13th century. Doesn't yet have a developed medical vocabulary the way that Latin, developing over the last 200 years since the translations of Gerard Cremona, has achieved. There are significant 13th century Arabic Hebrew translators of medical works. You'll see a number of them mentioned, alluded to in the handout that I think has gone around. But each one, it's not clear how much, at least at the early stages, how much communication there was between them, and whether perhaps each one had to work out his own vocabulary, and a common vocabulary would have arisen only in time by intercommunication. So here, in the case of Ben Mahir, in his translation, we've got another black box. What's going on in his mind as, given these Arabic words, he tries to create his own medical vocabulary in Hebrew. the strategies that Ben Mahir, like so many of the other 13th century translators, are summarized, I think, in the handout that you have. But the principal ones are making a new Hebrew word from an Arabic root that, as far as Ben Mahir can say, has no Hebrew equivalent. He understands the Arabic, but there's no Hebrew form for it yet. Using a Romance equivalent, this is particularly common in the case of drugs, medicines. He knows what the plant is. He knows its Occitan name. He doesn't know what name it has in Hebrew, so he will simply give the Romance term, the Occitan term. Sometimes he will simply transliterate the Arabic if neither of these techniques survive. Here's a page from the this is chapter 2 in the Hebrew translation of the text. The words you see that are in blue are highlighted in blue. Those are Romance words, Occitan words, embedded in there because he could find there was no Hebrew word that he knew. The violet words are Arabic in some form. But gradually, there is gradually a spreading of this new emerging Hebrew technical language, medical language. And Gerrit has suggested that perhaps Ben Mahir was acquainted with his uncle's medical translations and had used some of his uncle's medical terminology when he did his own medical translation here. I said that his translation suggested it was quick and hasty and looks like a draft. But of course, it isn't a draft. He doesn't think he needs to meet the needs of a Hebrew language medical culture because one doesn't exist yet. He's creating a medical Hebrew in the same way that a medical Latin was being created by Gerard of Cremona in the 12th century. But I want to say, and perhaps Joseph will say something more about this in just a minute, I think Ben Mahir was well aware of the limitations of Hebrew as a scientific language. Because I find it fascinating that he's not just willing to help university academics convert Arabic into Latin. He arranges with a number of scholars to translate his own astronomical writings. Remember, he's a noted astronomer. He gets members of the faculty to translate those writings written in Hebrew into Latin, I suspect, because in that way he can be sure of reaching the learned and technically competent audience that he can't yet expect in Hebrew. But maybe Joseph will say more about this as he talked about it much here. And I'll give you your genealogy right there.
Can you see the thing? Well, I'll explain it. Here is our hero, Jakob ben Mahir. This is Samuel Ibn Tibbon, the translator of Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. He is the son of a certain Judah who started the whole thing. But all of them are basically in southern France. He may have been born still in Granada, in an Arabic-speaking, but most of his Arabic is learned Arabic in southern France. This is Samuel, and he moved to Marseille. We have him there at 1211, and he will die around 1230 or so. We don't know exactly. He had, if I'm right, 3 children. Mahir, the father of Jacob, who died and has nothing, we know nothing about him. A daughter, Bella, who had 3 children, one of them very important, Benvenuta, which in all texts that I've seen is wrongly transcribed. people didn't know that the word Ben Yehuda. And you've got Moshe ibn Tibon, the son of Samuel, overworked translator, translates like crazy. And he has 2 sons, as a matter of fact. It's a pity that we don't have it here. He had a son, Judah, and he has another son, which is very important for us, Samuel. He has 2 sons. And his ambition in life is that his son marries his cousin. The son will marry his cousin, which a first cousin, which Jewish religion tolerates. No other sensible religion will accept. Anyhow, this is the thing. Who is translator here? He is a translator, of course. He is a translator, and he is a translator. That's it. Now, he is our hero here. I'll talk a little bit about the others too, but I'll read for you. Now, about my accent, people always ask me, what is your accent like? When I was professor in France, there was no problem. Everybody knew that they called me the German professor. While here, they want all to know where or what. And I say Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Yeah. With the exception of his name, his profession, his probable dwelling in Montpellier, and his activity around 1300, we know nothing about the surgeon Bernard Honofredi, other than the fact that he prepared a Latin translation of Ibn Zuhr, Regine. In contrast, manuscripts and archives provide considerable information about his collaborator in the venture, the Hebrew translator Jakob ben Mahir, presented in some documents as Jakob Tibon. The family is the Tibonide, and he is Tibon. Jacob was a collateral member of the Tibon family, who were famous as translator, and he is called also in other documents Profatius Judaeus or Profatius Judaeus, and so on. In the year 1299, when the translation was completed, Jacob was already a relatively old man, probably 70, if not older. He was then a long-time inhabitant in Montpellier, but not a native of the city. He has been born and raised in Marseille and lived for a time, short time, in Runel, near Montpellier. Let's say Montpellier. The Jewish community of Montpellier was, at that moment, one of the most important in Southern Europe, or in Europe, and numbered 1,000 persons, if not more, all of whom were to be expelled from the city in the summer of 1306, 7 years after the translation. A short autobiographical reflection prefixed to a single manuscript of his much earlier, the Arabic into Hebrew translation of Ibn al-Haytham, the configuration of the world, gives us a glimpse of Ben Mahir's early life. it tells us that he was orphaned at an early age and grew up with scant resources, with no family help or intellectual guidance. He began to purchase books, but acquired only imperfect understanding of their content. Then a friend of his asked him to translate an Arabic work of the astronomer Farghani, perhaps imagining that Jacob shared his family's gift. Ben Mahir replied, in reference to his relatives, the Determinants, I am not one of the translators. Hebrew, Eini me'anshei ha'ataka. By the way, an expression that we find only once in Hebrew literature. But he gave it a try anyway, and gradually, with the friend's help, he started to recover the Arabic he had once begun to learn. Now, not everyone accepts the authority of this little story. It has been said that it fits poorly with someone who was part of a family of famous translators and scholars. However, but the account implies that Jakob was very much on his own and not integrated in the family community. This can be regarded as a dependent report. We happen to know that the Determinants of Marseille of the mid-13th century, the family was a dysfunctional entity. The head of the clan, Moshe, whom you have, the Overworld translator, tried to arrange a marriage between the daughter of his sister and Samuel, that you don't see on the thing, one of his two sons. But the project did not work out. As the bride was exceedingly rich, all kinds of strangers did intervene, intending to profit financially from the crisis. The family strife reached the desks of several rabbinic authorities all over Europe, and also the court of the bishop of the city of Marseille. Jakob and Mahir must have been a teenager then, surviving as a neglected orphan. As well, the story is compatible with Ben Mahir's passion for astrology. Over the next several decades, he went on to produce Hebrew translation of more than half a dozen other Arabic astronomical and mathematical texts. Euclid, Qusam ibn Luka. I will jump the names and the things just in order to say Ibn Haytham, Ibn al-Shafar, and so on and so on. Ghazali, and the like. All of them either mathematics or astronomy. As well, the restricted preparation in Arabic language that the problematic note that not everybody accepts implies is underlined by other works of his, including the one that we present to you. He was not a great Arabist. One of the very earliest of his dated translation is the Elements of Euclid in 1255. He introduces with apology for his limited command of Arabic, but excusing it by claiming that the subject did, which means the mathematical subject, did not call for rich vocabulary. Do it with little vocabulary. Also, at least one Provençal translator, almost a century later, criticized his the same way. 30 years after Ben Mahir's death, a certain Judah, a Samuel, son of Judah of Marseille, his name was Barbavire in the market, born in 1294, made pointed complaints about the quality of Ben Mahir's translation of Averroes' compendium of Aristotle's Organon, logic, if you would like, declaring that it needed systematic retranslation, and in fact undertook the work himself. And there is a translation of Samuel, which is different than the translation of because of the Arabic, not that much different though. Today, manuscripts of the text sometimes carry both the names of Jakob and Samuel as translator, as if they are the result of collaboration, which is certainly not the case. Samuel was 10 years old when Jacob died. It's not collaboration, it simply corrects Jacob. Perhaps it is worth pointing out that at an early stage of his career, Jacob arranged with a Latin scholar, John of Brescia, to produce the translation of Zarkalis Safeha, astronomy, from Arabic to Latin. Jacob's translation of the Arabic into the Romance vernacular, and John then rendered it into Latin. Only afterwards did Jacob prepare his own version of the Arabic in Hebrew, exactly like our case. He had again wanted to get help on the meaning of the Arabic, as is the case in what I talked about in the previous one. However, 5 decades of unbroken dedication to astronomy, 5 decades of it, not just translation, but independent original tracts, laying out designs for new observational instruments, did not automatically make Jakob a wealthy man. A remark that he made in the astronomical tables, again original, that he drew up in Hebrew in 1301 for Montpellier, suggests that he felt resignation, if not disappointment, at the fact. The Latin translation, made almost immediately, has him saying, per astrologiam lucrum not acquiritur. You don't acquire wealth, if you would like, from astrology. But the Hebrew text is more explicit. I quote, "Astronomy is not a lucrative profession and does not promise great reward. Young men would do better to study law or medicine in order to make a living." So how did he survive? Reaching the age of 70 or close to it. He could have practiced medicine, but we have no evidence to support this possibility. And yet, he was by no means impoverished. The Montpellier notarial records from the period are almost all lost. This is a huge tragedy. I worked in Montpellier. They start having documents in significant number around 1370, 1380. For the great period of 1300, nothing. We found, nevertheless, a register. One register survived for 1302, and Jakob was wealthy enough to purchase a house in the town for the considerable sum of 105 pounds, which is very much in medieval terms. So he must have gained his living somehow. Let me suggest that some of his income came as payments for translations. To engage in translation must have entailed, perhaps even often, expectation of monetary remuneration. Even though the evidence for this possibility is thin and sporadic, there are documents that indicate that translators of the period were conscious about the financial value of their work. The medical doctors who used the fruit of their labor certainly charged their patients. For translators, thus, we have the example of a contemporary of Jakob, the Sicilian Faraj ibn or Ben Salim of Agrigento. He was remunerated by King Charles of Anjou in the early 1280s, not only for translating the medical encyclopedia Al-Hawi of Rhazes from Arabic to Latin. He was paid separately for correcting the mistakes that the scribe had introduced into his work. The original, by the way, with the handwriting of Salim, exists in Paris. Another of Jacob's contemporaries, Jakob of Tortosa, which Michael mentioned, inhabitant of Marseille, undertook in the 1260s a gigantic challenge of rendering to Hebrew the encyclopedic Kitab at-Tasrif of Abul Qasis al-Zahrawi.
Wonderful.
He translated al-Zahrawi, which you have seen for the chapter on their Michael just showed us the the picture with for the
Surgery.
for the surgery. Thank you for the thing. He died. The translator translated it, and then around 1300, a doctor of Montpellier, a Jewish doctor, wanted to produce a copy for himself. He got the book for a year, to keep it for a year and be able to translate it during the year, or to transcribe it, to copy it as a matter of fact. But he paid the price of a house just for the permission to use, copy the translation. Then I have a case of Kalonymos ben Kalonymos, who is paid also. I never mind, I wouldn't insist. He was translating, so to speak, from the Arabic to the Latin, and he was paid not very much for his translations. Michael knows yet of another case of payment. So I think that we can take it very seriously, that a translation was done. And if Moses ben Ibn Tibbon translated about I don't know how much, it's probably this is the way that he made a living. And it may be that Jakob made a living too. Now, in Montpellier, Jakob was very much appreciated by the Jewish community, among others because his relations with the university were very close. The university found so in him, here as an Arabist, they didn't know what I would think about his Arabic. They thought that he really knows Arabic, and they will translate. And they worked with him, which impressed very much the Jews, the status that he had within the non-Jewish community. He was also an Aristotelian and an Averroist, although they do not mention the name Averroes. Averroes was too dangerous a name to mention, because Averroes claimed that basically Aristotle as important as the Bible is. He didn't say that the Bible is worth nothing, but it was more or less the same level. And they, in the preaching at the synagogue, they say that when the Bible talks about Abraham and Sarah, they mean really the form and the matter of Aristotle. By the same token, the 12 tribes are the constellations in heaven. And the Urim and Tumim that the priest, the high priest, has on his chest, that Aaron has on his chest, is basically an astrological instrument. Moreover, which is worse, they did believe that there is a way to heal the sickness of kidneys astrologically. And by the way, also Arnold of Villanova tried to heal the Pope, Boniface VIII, by putting this kind of instrument on his kidneys. Anyhow, they wanted, there started a fight between the Orthodox Jews of Montpellier and Jakob ben Mahir. But Jakob and his friends and his cousin, by the way, that you have here, Judah, were much stronger. They couldn't, they simply were much stronger. they had to apply to Barcelona, where there was the great Rabbi Solomon ben Adret, and they asked him to issue a excommunication against those who will study philosophy before the age of 25. And with the exception of two disciplines, all Greek philosophy should be put aside, with the exception of medicine and astronomy. In the meantime, this happened in June 1305. Jakob and Mahir died in the meantime. Last time that we see him is in August 1304, and by June 1305 he died. On a short level, he lost on a long level until the expulsion of the Jews from France and from Provence. He was a winner, if you would like. Now, I would like to tell you something about just 3 minutes. Ben Mahir and all these guys are writing when paper was introduced to Southern Europe from Spain. And writing became easy and not very expensive. Hence, scholars, among them our hero, indulged in graphomania and covered hundreds and thousands of pages. Think just of the Aragonese Ramon Lull, who in his 250 books wrote about almost everything that exists under the sun. These mountains of written papers are to be found in various archives and libraries, which are often strictly administered and difficult to handle. And young people should start trying to to climb on this mountain and start to walk on it. Thank you.